Live from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to the National Pulse. Our discussion today, Stewardship of Covid-19 Resources. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZimCOD. Hello, I'm Andy Hodges. Now, COVID-19 has ravaged the world, killing over 376,000 people globally. Zimbabwe so far has 206 cases with, unfortunately, 4 deaths. This pandemic has crippled most health systems, prompting governments to channel more resources towards their health sectors. Furthermore, governments have received support from numerous multinational organizations, business and private players. Today, we look at the management and effective utilization of these resources. Joining us on the National Pulse today to discuss stewardship of COVID-19 resources, we are joined in the studio by Tafodza Chikumbu, socio-economic analyst at the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZimCOD. And joining us during the show virtually, we will be speaking to Dr. Shingi Munyeza, pastor, businessman, entrepreneur, and member of the Presidential Advisory Council, and Roswitha Katsande, Executive Director, Youth Empowerment and Transformation Trust, YET. Now, please, if you have any comments or views on our show today, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zimpaper's TV network, or via our Twitter handle at ZTN News. Tafodza, welcome to the National Pulse.
Thank you so much.
Now, let's get into the crux, because I think the issue is the baseline. Does the existing framework for public finance management provide guidelines or principles of stewardship of public resources?
Okay, thanks, Andy. I think our Constitution of 2013 is one piece of legislation which we should always praise ourselves for coming up with such a document. It's a document that provides clearly in terms of the principles of public finance management, principles specifically those that have to do with transparency and accountability in the use and management of public resources. And we actually have a whole chapter in the Constitution which speaks about public finance management in general, and also how procurement procedures have to be followed, how the government has to come up with acts of parliament that supports the procurement, how excess expenditures can be regulated, in the oversight role of parliament in terms of public finance management. And we also have a specific act of parliament, which is the Public Finance Management Act, which regulates public finance management in general. It actually secures the national pace in terms of following transparency, accountability, competitive bidding processes. How do you safeguard the national resources in the event that the resources have been lost from the national pace? It actually provides penalties and charges, especially to the accounting officers responsible for the resource leakages. So in short, it does provide specific principles in which public resources have to be used, specifically one that speaks to ensuring that the resources are being used to the best interest of Zimbabwe, especially when we have a crisis of this nature, COVID-19, where we are getting donations from all over the world. We are also mobilizing our own resources domestically, and those resources have to be put in best use. And that is done by individuals, including the Ministry of Finance, which has specific responsibilities for controlling the mobilization of resources and also its expenditure. And we also have specific roles that have been designated for Parliament, for the Auditor General, for the Prosecutor General, for Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission, and all the other accountability institutions. So I think in a nutshell, we do have both legal, institutional, and all those provisions that...
I mean, you make a good point. I think we did a show where they talked about the biggest complaints at the moment among citizens, and that was really in the corrupt practice of distributing food aid, which is not a government issue, is it? This is more about individuals on the ground taking advantage of the situation.
Yeah, actually, of course, the government has been entrusted with our resources. These are resources that you and I pay in terms of taxes. These are resources that everyone else contributes to, including the development partners. And it is their responsibility to ensure it is being put into best use. But sometimes it's not broadly government's inefficiency, but sometimes it's about individuals that are entrusted with the use of resources that sometimes end up abusing their powers. And that's why we talk about corruption, for instance, which is considered to be one of the enemies in terms of
And that's where they
progress.
have ZAC and these organizations
Yes.
to get down on those individuals that are abusing our resources. And as I said, this isn't government, this is specific individuals all around the country who are doing this.
Yes.
Now, joining us in the National Purse Stewardship of COVID-19 Resources is Dr. Shingi Munyeza. He's a pastor and businessman. Shingi, welcome to the National Purse.
Thank you very much, Andy, and good afternoon to you and your listeners and viewers.
Good afternoon. Now, the African Union, which includes Zimbabwe, have been calling for cancellation of the country's external debt to allow it to channel resources to social safety nets, which of course includes the health sector. What would be your comment on this? What really should we do here in terms of debt cancellation? Do you agree with this?
Well, I totally agree with it. We have been faced with all sorts of unusual circumstances. Besides the issue of corruption, which I won't delve into for now because I think it was covered by my colleague there. But if you look at the following, if you look at the fact that for 2 years in running, we have had a terrible drought. And then we had Cyclone Idai, and then we have had COVID-19. Certainly that has left a lot of our initiatives, our reserves, our ability to service those debts very weakened and to some extent impossible. So I think based on that alone, if that was to be considered alone, we do need to have a debt cancellation.
I mean, Shingi, it seems weird because I mean, we look at countries like Ethiopia, Eritrea, who have had billions of dollars wiped off their debt. We look at Rwanda, for example, who has received money from institutions, but Zimbabwe seems to be left out, and I think that doesn't seem to be very fair.
Of course, the global arena is not a fair playing field. You've got to also play to it so that you get your best advantage there. I guess one of the things is that when you go back, what we needed to have done as a country to get ourselves back in line with IFIs, we have not managed to do that. Just for debt services, forget the issue of sanctions, which is another conversation altogether. But the journey of saying there was a Lima agreement, we're going to go through reforms, structural reforms, and make sure that we line up to our fiscus in order for us to then qualify for debt restructuring and even debt forgiveness. We didn't do that. It fell flat on its face. And we also started the SMP, the Staff Monitoring Program. These are programs that anyone who's looking at funding or debt forgiveness and all this looks at and you say, look, did you do your part? So that we can also do our part.
But to be fair, Shingi, I mean, the government of Zimbabwe has, of course, put in place quite a robust, or they thought they put in place a robust economic plan, which tried to sort of justify the anomalies or fix the anomalies in the economy, which have been there for many years, for the last 10, 15 years. I mean, that's a true statement.
According to you, yes. But according to me, no, Andy, because the proof of the pudding is in the eating. What has been the result? What has been the outcome?
Okay.
You give me the indicators right now that have impacted on because any economy must eventually be measured by the welfare of its citizens, not just looking at economic indicators. We must look at actually the welfare of the citizens. So let's look at the issue that we're talking about right now is the health sector. What has been done there?
Right, I mean, that takes me to exactly the right question. I mean, the fact is that we've had donations under COVID-19, and we've had donations and loans and grants given to the country. So really the oversight role of institutions such as Parliament, Comptroller and Auditor General, should they be more actively involved in this process?
Yes, the issue of donations in a crisis has to comply with transparency and accountability rules. And as my colleague has said, that these are enshrined in our Constitution. Just apply the Constitution. It doesn't need for us to reinvent the wheel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is just an issue of implementation. It is the will, the political will, to make sure we do the right thing.
Okay, now you are a member of the Presidential Advisory Council. Have you met and recommended any best ways of utilizing COVID-19 resources, particularly looking at the area of rebudgeting, allocating from other sectors to health or to areas that really give the people more social safety nets?
Well, sorry about that, Andy. With all due respect to you and your audience, I am not a spokesperson for the Presidential Advisory Council.
Okay, all right. I'll take that then, sir. So, I mean, then in your own personal view then, do you think that there is a best way of allocating resources so that the majority of people in Zimbabwe that are crying out for that help from government get it?
Well, for me, it's simple. If we follow the Constitution, the structures are there. The accountability is there. The transparency is there. The way to determine the vulnerable is there. And we have various institutions that take care of this. So the issue is about governance. The issue is about competence. The issue is about capacity in order to deliver to the vulnerable.
Now, Shingi, you're a pastor, so obviously you meet your parishioners, or you meet people, of course, who'd like to come and chat to you or tell you about their issues. What are the major issues, do you think, in terms of this COVID-19 that are really affecting the ordinary citizen of the country?
The first thing is that because there's been rampant corruption around the COVID-19 and accountability, it's corruption and also account. People don't know what they are supposed to get. So there is not enough communication out there so that people can expect and go and claim what they are supposed to get. And then the other aspect, the evil that has been there, is also the corruption. So we're then caught up in there where people just look at survival. So the COVID-19, people are not tilted towards the prevention of COVID-19. People are now more tilted to survival. Now you've got a drought and there's no food, and you've got an economic crisis that we're facing. And now you need to, and the borders are closed. Our economy is informalized to a great extent. People were buying and selling, cross-border traders and these small-scale miners and all these other informal traders have been now trapped into this COVID-19 now. Not because they are infected, but because now they are affected by the dysfunctionality that is brought through by COVID-19.
Great. Dr. Shingi Munyeza, pastor and businessman, thank you very much for participating on the National Pulse.
Thank you very much, and good day to you.
Good day to you, sir. Tafazo, I think one area I'd like to look at a little bit further is this debt cancellation issue, because I think it's clear. I mean, we have had numerous countries in Africa have had their debt cancelled. We've had Cyril Ramaphosa, who's at the moment heading the African Union, calling for debt cancellation of African nations. And of course, our own Minister of Finance has written to various international multilateral lenders asking for exactly that. It appears we're hitting a brick wall, yet it is so critical right now that the world gets together and does this. Your comments on that?
Oh, okay. I think the discourse around debt cancellation is more important now than ever before, especially considering that the whole world is actually experiencing the devastating impacts of COVID-19. When they look at Zimbabwe and the other macroeconomic challenges that we have, sometimes they look at it from an outside perspective, but I'm sure they are now looking at it as a global challenge, and they know the impacts thereof, especially at a time when Zimbabwe's macroeconomic performance is not so well. It means that we need debt cancellation more than ever before. But at the same time, I think it is important for citizens to understand the dynamics behind the debt cancellation that was actually extended by the IMF recently. I think Zimbabwe does not owe IMF in terms of the principal amount that we borrowed. I mean, it only owes IMF the principal amount that we borrowed, but in terms of the arrears, the penalties and other charges that were associated with the delays in payments, we actually cleared that in 2016 or 2018 when we drew down our special drawing rights, which reside with the IMF. So we have resources that are in the PES, which are being held by the IMF, and we went to an agreement that can we use those special drawing rights to clear our arrears, to clear our penalties and other charges. And we did clear that. So I think in this particular discourse, I think maybe what we should be discussing about is the IMF should extend debt cancellation beyond the penalties, arrears and other charges to include the principal amount that Zimbabwe owes to the IMF. Before we discuss that, I think in terms of the arrears, we are well cleared with the IMF.
If you look at someone like the World Bank, I mean, there's another problem there, because what the World Bank is doing is suspending debt payments, aren't they? They're not writing them off. Yeah. They're just deferring them to later, probably in 1 or 2 years' time. Unfortunately, Zimbabwe is already in arrears with the World Bank, so we're here looking at debt forgiveness, really. That would be the best possible outcome for us.
Yeah, actually, for other institutions like the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, AFDB, we still owe them in arrears. And the World Bank has not, of course, extended debt forgiveness to any country. But what they've done is to offer concessionary support and grants, including the one that was extended to Zimbabwe. I think we received or get 7 million from the World Bank. These are some of the efforts in which these multilateral institutions are also putting a hand in addressing the COVID-19 issue. But I think, you know, these institutions, they also operate on a profit basis, looking at the opportunity cost of giving money to Zimbabwe. They should have made money elsewhere, and they had been charging interest and penalties to our country. And I'm sure even if debt cancellation is not possible, I'm sure they can as well suspend the arrears, the penalties, so that they can't keep accumulating, especially during these times, such that even they should also suspend debt repayment, such that the resources that were supposed to be paid to the World Bank, African Development Bank and IMF should actually be earmarked towards COVID-19 up until a time when the government is capable to finance its own challenges.
I think, let's be clear, I'd like you to clear up something. I mean, when we talk about grants and money coming in from multi-international donors, this is not necessarily cash going directly to government, is it? I think people perceive that when the World Bank says we're giving you 7 million, it means that the Zimbabwe government is getting 7 million. That's not actually the case. A lot of this funding is going directly to suppliers, particularly of products, particularly in the health sector, or to buy machinery and so forth. Maybe you could comment on that.
Oh, okay. I think it's a broader issue beyond the relationship between World Bank, the IMF, and I think it has a history actually, where the arrears that we owe to the World Bank, IMF, African Development Bank, they date as far back as 2000. You know, we borrowed in the 90s and 80s, and by the year 2000, we had not paid our arrears, and in amount, we were not paying anything. And as a result, they had mistrust. You know, sometimes when you lend someone money and it does not take an action to repay, sometimes you create conditions. And Zimbabwe received similar conditions from the IMF, from the World Bank, and they actually withdrew their funding support to Zimbabwe. And as a result, there are certain conditions which Zimbabwe has to meet in terms of fiscal and monetary policy reforms, and which, in my view, Zimbabwe has not done enough. And the IMF report, which was released in March, actually pointed out a number of missteps that were followed in terms of implementing the monetary policy, the fiscal policy itself, including the issue of the exchange rate, where we have an exchange rate system which has proved to be inefficient, where the business community is actually responding to changes in the parallel market system.
Now, we did ask Dr. Munyeza about accountability institutions like Parliament, ZAC, and so on. And it appears that, you know, the Auditor General is a good example. How actively involved should they be in the stewardship of COVID-19 resources?
Oh, okay. Ordinarily, the Auditor General receives financial statements from different government departments, including ministries, parastatals, and local authorities. And their function is well designated in the Constitution, well designated in the Public Finance Management Act in terms of what they have to do. And normally, under normal circumstances, they do their audits on an annual basis, where we have a comprehensive Auditor General's report on appropriation accounts. These are accounts held by the ministries, on local authorities, on parastatals. And they do their job thoroughly. And I think you remember a time when Madam Chiri was supposed to leave office, and even members of parliament supported that she should remain in office because she's doing a great job. And so after releasing that particular report, it's a responsibility of parliament to look at the issues raised by the Auditor General, but at the same time make recommendations in terms of actions that have to be taken, especially for those people that would have misused funds. I think during times like this, when we have COVID-19, and we also have reports of abuse of resources and allegations of individuals and departments not following procurement procedures, sometimes it is important to ensure that the internal audit systems within the government ministries should actually carry out their jobs under the supervision of the Auditor General's report, Auditor General's office, such that we ensure that we do not wait longer and wait until the Auditor General does the comprehensive analysis within a period of 12 months. So we should actually have regular audits which are actually done by internal auditors within various ministries, which reports should be submitted to the Auditor General.
Just as a private business would do in general. Yeah.
Precisely.
I want to talk, I mean, previously on the National Purse, we've had members of different public committees at the Parliament of Zimbabwe, and they have talked very strongly about how our constitution is strong in terms of public finance management, and the rules are very clear in there. But they've also mentioned, all of them, the fact there is a disconnect between the actual constitution and the rules that are stated in there and actual practice. And we've tried to get to the bottom of the powers that any oversight committee has to bridge that gap, to make the executive accountable for what it spends, particularly when it comes to management of resources, whether it's COVID-19 resources or in general. So what do you think can be done to strengthen that sort of, that disconnect between the fact and action?
Oh, okay. Of course, the Constitution is now more robust than the Public Finance Management Act. Hence the discussion around the alignment of the PFM Act to the Constitution, which decision the government has made, and I'm sure there's already a discussion in Parliament, and even civil society have been involved in that particular discourse. The only challenge for now is that it's taking longer than expected. Since we had our Constitution in 2013 and deliberations around alignment of laws to the Constitution, I think we should have done that before, but what I would say is that we need to expedite that particular process. But at the same time, we do have principles, we do have certain procedures which are very clear in all these pieces of legislation. And we also look at corruption with impunity, where everyone knows that if you misuse resources, the Auditor General unearths all the irregularities, nothing is actually done, or probably it takes years for government departments to submit financial statements for audit. And I'll give you an example of city of Chitungwiza municipality, which actually submitted 2015 financial statements to the Auditor General in 2018. So some people who might have perpetrated all the irregularities might have even left the institution. Some of them might have even died. So sometimes they should actually bridge the gap and make sure that if monthly financial statements are to be submitted, because that's what the Public Finance Management Act states. If you look at Section 42 to Section 44, it specifically talks about when financial statements have to be submitted. But this is not happening in government departments, simply because there are no deterrent measures. The Public Finance Management Act clearly outlines what has to be done, especially if you look at Section 88, 89 of the Public Finance Management Act. It actually states the penalties if a public officer does not spend resources well. They're actually supposed to be charged, I think, in line with level 10 or even imprisonment, or including both a level 10 and also ensuring that they also pay a fine to recover the lost resources. So this is actually clear in our constitution. But the practice.
I mean, let's take it now to our COVID-19 resources. We're getting an unusual amount of money coming in, whether it be grants, loans, or whatever form of assistance, even in kind, whether it's food and so forth. I mean, that still applies to this as well, doesn't it? I mean, if you had individuals or different units reporting as and when this is happening or on a monthly basis, it would cut down a lot on the leakages, which the Auditor General in the last report highlighted as well. So the question is, of course, how the leakages, are they still there, and can they be plugged, and how can they be plugged? Is that one way of doing it?
Oh, okay. Yeah, Zimbabwe as a country is faced with leakages from both ends, from the collection of revenues. I think we do have leakages, and the Zimbabwe Revenue Authority, in their latest report, they actually talked about their efforts in terms of recovering lost revenues at the point of collection. But at the same time, we also have revenue which is leaking from the national purse, where we have resources already and we are celebrating, but then we have government departments that are actually not using the resources in the best interest of Zimbabwe. And as a result, I think it does affect even service delivery. And the government should at all times try to ensure that they don't just strengthen the legal and institutional frameworks, but at the same time they also think of deterrent measures, those measures that ensures that even when someone misuses resources, of course, they should actually have examples. But currently we do have high-ranking officials having been alleged to have abused public resources. They are imprisoned, they are released, and sometimes people lose confidence in terms of what is happening. So
deterrent sentences to fit the crime. That makes sense. It's time for us to take a breather. You're watching The National Purse. Our discussion today, Stewardship of COVID-19 Resources. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZimCOD. Don't go away. We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is The National Purse. Our discussion today, Stewardship of COVID-19 Resources. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZimCOD. Now, I want to get back to this leakages issue, because you mentioned something which is quite interesting, because what these lower level officials or what officials are doing through these leakages or through alleged corruption or taking money is really affecting the social safety nets. Is affecting money that could have been spent on other important things that required Zimbabwe citizens. And I think we need to explore more what can happen to them, because right now it appears, as you said earlier, they're dealing with impunity. That has to change, does it not?
Yeah, sure. Actually, going back to the theme of our discussion today, which is stewardship of our national resources. Stewardship as a principle, I think it's also biblical, that when someone is entrusted with resources, I think they have to do the best. And in our case, we always report that we have funding challenges because we are not getting resources directly into the national purse. It is actually coming off the budget. And we also have, our tax collections, they are not as much. So I think the best we can do is to ensure that we safeguard. I
mean, the government has already given a number to how much taxes they think we're losing, and it's billions, isn't it?
Yeah. So we simply have to do the best in terms of safeguarding those resources. And the best way to do that is to have deterrent measures, which I've spoken about. And also, even if the measures are there, we need the political will to implement that. I think at several occasions, we do have Parliament unearthing a lot of issues in Parliament in relation to abuse of resources. But we also have a whole value chain of institutions, oversight institutions. You know, the buck does not stop with Parliament. They have to recommend, and the recommendations have to be taken to ZAG. ZAG have to do their investigations. The issues have to go to the Prosecutor General. Issues have to be transferred to our courts. So many things happen between the Auditor General and probably our judicial system. So I think there's need for that collaboration and coordination between the accountability institutions to ensure that even the Auditor General, when ZAC does its investigations, they should also involve competent auditors, some of them which reside within the Office of the Auditor General, to ensure that we also collect enough facts, we do the forensics, and ensuring that those that are found on the other side of the law are actually brought to book.
Now we have to join our guest now, Roswitha Katsande, Executive Director, Youth Empowerment and Transformation Trust, YET. Roswitha, welcome to the National Pulse.
Thank you.
Now, Roswitha, YET's vision is, and I quote, a just, inclusive and prosperous society where young people fully participate and lead in sustainable development. So, what is the role of civil society organizations, including your own, in ensuring that COVID-19 resources are effectively managed, and how will this help to achieve your own organization's vision?
Okay. For me, civil society organizations play an important role in ensuring that funds to tackle COVID-19 pandemic reach their destination. The funds are managed effectively and efficiently. So because civil society organizations play a watchdog role, it means they need to provide oversight on the COVID-19 responses and also be able to analyze how these funds are being utilized. Civil society organizations can contribute to ensuring that funds are utilized effectively in the following ways. One, they can contribute to anti-corruption initiatives by informing citizens about their rights and entitlement as per the Zimbabwean Constitution and other provisions. So we need citizens that are informed of their rights and also that can be able to demand for improved service delivery and development outcomes. Civil society organizations can also be able to ensure that citizens access information and also that there's broader participation by communities, including those from hard-to-reach places and marginalized groups of people. Because when you look at the nature and the structure of civil society that we have in Zimbabwe, some are also working with marginalized communities covering the whole country. Civil society organizations can also ensure monitoring of COVID-19 responses by government and how these resources are being utilized. And they also need to do advocacy around any gaps or violations that would have been noted. And it's also important that civil society organizations also do a lot of community monitoring to assess the preparedness of government to respond to COVID-19, monitoring distribution of PPEs, the impact of lockdown on citizens, and also be able to engage policymakers to explain how these funds are utilized, and also for civil society organizations to be able to demand for public disclosure of sources of revenue, allocation of funds, and how the public procurement procedures are being handled. And because of the current COVID-19 lockdown, there is also room for civil society organizations to utilize online civic engagement to be able to reach out to citizens in regard to these issues. And I also think civil society also has to be able to track in any illicit financial flows so that there is increased awareness of corruption risk, which then results in the addressing of such anomalies. So from my submission, I think it is very clear that civil society organizations, they do have a role to play in strengthening governance accountability with regards to how COVID-19 funds are utilized.
Now, Roswitha, your organization is a youth networking organization committed to the full participation of young people in sustainable development through advocacy and capacity building of youth and youth organizations in Zimbabwe. So what effect has COVID-19 had on the youth in Zimbabwe? Do you think they are being overlooked in this crisis?
Thank you. So as yet, we conducted a rapid online survey to find out youth perceptions about COVID-19 and measures being taken by government to protect Zimbabwe from the pandemic. So when we carried out this online survey, we noted that one, young people are extremely concerned about the closure of schools, colleges, and universities, which has disrupted their learning. Online learning has resulted in inequalities because students don't have the same access to technology and data. So, one, the lockdown, the COVID-19 has greatly affected education of young people. We also found out that young people are very concerned about their financial positions. Most young people derive their income from the informal sector, and the lockdown seriously affected their capacity to generate income for themselves and their families. And so you have a lot of young people who are in the informal sector who are affected by were affected by COVID-19. And the COVID-19 has also resulted in significant job losses, both in the formal and in the formal sectors, with a possibility of erosion of decent and fair work, which results in a lot of young people with no means to sustain themselves, resulting in increased poverty. Thirdly, we also noted that there are challenges around mental health and well-being for young people. The lockdown measures have had a huge effect on the mental health of young people in Zimbabwe. The restrictions of movement, public gatherings, and closure of borders and informal sector operations, and the inability of young people to provide for themselves and their families under these changed conditions have all negatively affected young people. We also realized and also got feedback from young people that the lockdown restrictions on movement has also affected their ability to access basic services such as food, shelter, medicines, water, among others. Because of the lockdown, we have also noted that there is now a strain on social relations within families and friends, and we've also had increased cases of gender-based violence as communities face the rising economic pressures.
Now, Roswitha, bearing in mind our topic, which of course is stewardship of COVID-19 resources, you talked about CSOs and organizations like yourself doing community monitoring. So how do you think that government can improve the distribution of funds under the country's social safety nets, get it to the right people? Do you have any recommendations on how that can be done more effectively, with bearing in mind your work with communities around the country?
So my submission is that firstly, the government, when they come up with these social safety nets, it is important that they consult stakeholders in terms of how these social safety nets are supposed to be structured and also who's going to benefit. Secondly, there's also needs to ensure that there's transparency and accountability in terms of the requirements, the application process, selection, and also the beneficiaries of these social safety nets. So, for example, we are currently engaging the Ministry of Youth and the Zimbabwe Youth Council to also follow up on how many young people, for example, have benefited from the Youth Relief Fund, which is meant to benefit young people who are in business and youth associations. So I think when we come up with those social safety nets, it's important, one, to ensure that it's an inclusive process and that the selection criteria is very clear and there's transparency. And I would also want to push to say if we have this kind of social safety nets, it's also important that we also have, public access to the people that would have benefited from those kind of initiatives. So there's need to ensure that there's transparency and accountability when these social safety nets are implemented.
Roswitha Kasande, Executive Director, Youth Empowerment and Transformation Trust. Yet, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Now, Tafazwa, it's interesting because both of our callers that we did virtually there raised just a few things. They raised a lot, of course, but let me just highlight some of them. I mean, both of them said transparency, accountability, and also more what's the word? More information going out to how the funds are spent, who it's spent on, and what for. And also another thing which is interesting is the lack of communication, or what the grassroots people feel is that there's not enough communication telling them what's there, where they should go, what they should do. Your comments on that?
Yeah, I think, of course, they are speaking specifically to the Constitution, which is the supreme law of the land. And actually, if you read through the founding values, I think the Constitution has to be respected by every individual in this country, including those in the executive, including parliament, including judiciary, and all the other departments of government. And I'm sure issues of transparency and accountability, it keeps coming in all the conversation, especially those that relate to the mobilization of resources, utilization of resources. And from the conversation that we got from Roswitha Kasande around the role of civil society, it is specifically our role not to just ensure that we uphold our own constitution, but also to ensure that even the international best practices continue to be embedded in our own principles, in our constitution, to ensure that we get the best out of our resources. I think that is primarily important. And I think there was also a conversation around ensuring that citizens do benefit from the resources that are due to them. And one way of doing that is to ensure that they also participate in decision making, because they are the ones that are supposed to get the food, or that are supposed to get the money. And the conversation that we have had with citizens, and in the wake of rising inflation, which is now in excess of 700%, citizens strongly feel that they would actually benefit more if they get hampers rather than getting money. Because currently the allocated 180 RTGS dollars per whether individual or household is too little, considering that a 2 kg of sugar now costs 165 RTGS dollars. So it would actually do better if citizens do get food hampers, because I'm sure as we...
But that's been happening though. They have been getting mealie meal and so forth. I mean, that has been distributed, has it not?
Yeah, of course.
That's a similar sort of thing.
Yeah,
that's what they're calling for, more of that.
For more of that,
now,
and also ensuring that, because those that were getting food hampers, I think, are the traditional beneficiaries of social safety nets. But when government introduced the cash transfers, it is actually meant for the urban population. And I'm sure those marginalized in urban centers, they also prefer having the food hampers.
I have to ask you the final question, because we are coming to the end of the show. But based on previous cases cited in the Auditor General's report in 2018, the report, is the government doing enough to correct anomalies in the public procurement system? This is the tender process. What's happening in that, and what can be done to make that tighter?
Okay. Of course, the government has done, especially in 2017, we came up with a new piece of legislation, the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Assets Act of 2017, which is quite robust in terms of what government needs to do in terms of ensuring that they follow Chapter 15 of our Constitution, in terms of following competitive, having a fair bidding process. And then, so it actually makes it more clear in that particular act. And it's one act which is quite commendable in terms of what government did. But like I said before, the issue is not about legal instruments. It's about implementation. And I'm sure the government still needs to do a lot in enforcing implementation of what is in our pieces of legislation.
Because I know that they did relax the procurement under this pandemic, but the issue is do it smart, do it right, not do it fast.
Yeah, actually, in terms of relaxation of procedures, of course, it's ensuring that, of course, we will not follow the long process, but it's still that procurement process have to be fair, has to be equitable, has to be done in a competitive way to ensure that we do not award tenders to people who do not deserve them. And as a result, I think it ends up actually affecting the delivery of services, not just for COVID-19, but it also affects public service delivery, especially in a case where there are allegations of probably companies that got tenders where their prices were inflated. So it means there's an opportunity cost of those resources that were allocated to the same consignment rather than being allocated towards something else.
Well, we've come to the end of our show. We'd like to thank our panelists, Tafadzwa Chikumbu, Socio-Economic Analyst at the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZIMCOD, Dr. Shingi Munyeza, pastor, businessman, entrepreneur, and Roswitha Katsande, Executive Director, Youth Empowerment and Transformation Trust, YET. You have been watching The National Purse, Stewardship of COVID-19 Resources. This is from ZTN Studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpaper's TV network ZTN and our partners, the Zimbabwe Coalition on Debt and Development, ZIMCOD. If you have any comments or views on our show today, please feel free to contact us via our Facebook page, Zimpaper's TV network, or via our Twitter handle at ZTN News. And our final comment. Stewardship policies are generally seen as beneficial because they promote greater overall transparency and accountability. This fosters a culture of responsibility, confidence and trust, which are important to both Zimbabwe's partners and its citizens. This new view of stewardship, along with our understanding of opportunity cost, means that to be a good steward requires us to be aware of the trade-offs we face and to confront them with intentionality. Stewardship with a capital S means thinking about how we steward all of our resources and gifts, not just our money. In relation to resources under COVID-19, how the government manages its scarce resources becomes even more important. I'm Andy Hodges. Goodbye, and you all be safe.